Hey guys, thanks for checking out the video. Today I want to show you around one of my very favorite new plugins, Gullfoss by Sound Theory. Okay, so what is Gullfoss? That's a little bit harder to describe than you might think because it's really something that hasn't existed until pretty recently. The website describes it as an intelligent EQ that uses sound theory's computational auditory perception model. And I think essentially what that means is that it attempts to take a sound that you feed into it and adjust the shape, the spectral shape of that to something that is slightly more pleasing to the human ear. So I'm sure there's lots of fancy science and technology behind it, but it does seem to do just that somehow. So let's get into it and we can kind of look through the interface and you can see that, yeah, while it is an EQ, there is a curve being applied here. There are no bands, there's no dials. It just has these basic controls. So recover and tame being the main controls affecting the signal, and a couple of other modifiers over here that we'll get into. While it is EQing the source, it's doing it in a dynamic way and without any of the controls that we're accustomed to, as a traditional EQ would go. So it just makes things sound better. It takes whatever you feed into it, you tweak it a tiny bit, and I literally have not come across a single source or mix that it hasn't just made a little bit better, which is pretty incredible. So this is not really going to be a review. I've just been using this for a month, maybe 2 months, and I've found where it's useful in my workflow. I found a couple of tricks, how I generally approach using it on a mix or a bus or a master. And I just want to share a bit of that with you so you can hear it and see it in action. Let's jump into this first project here. I'm going to bypass Gullfoss and play a bit of this mix with it not affecting the signal at all. I'll go ahead and turn it on right here. Okay, now it's definitely subtle, so subtle that it may be difficult to hear through, YouTube compression, but it's doing a pretty good amount, and literally with like no work at all. So this instance is on my master bus right before. I think the only things after this are my main mastering limiter, and I think I do have one EQ doing a couple of moves right before that limiter, but it's just right near the end of the chain. It's getting just about everything. So I'll start with it on and then turn it off in about the same spot, and sometimes you can hear that a little more when it's there and then it's gone. All of a sudden the mix won't feel as balanced. In this particular mix, the guitars and bass poke forward in ways that are more obtrusive than they are with it on, and then you lose a little bit of this like cool sparkly thing that it's adding to the very tippy top, where you can mostly hear that in some of his drum sprinkles. So his like ride and hat work that he's doing that kind of stand out on either side, those become a little less apparent when it's bypassed. So let's try that. So it really does. With it bypassed, it just gets more congested in the mids. Things don't sit as well as they do with it on. And this is only affecting the mix bus. So it's not like it has control over, individual elements of the mix or my buses or stems or anything like that. So it's kind of crazy that just with doing some dynamic shape changing, it can add so much clarity and width and glue, really, just kind of glues everything together. So I'm not using a whole lot of, I guess, the options in this mix. So in the manual, they say that cover is for treating the dominated components of a mix, where tame treats the dominant components of a mix. which again is just kind of hard to think about in those terms just because they're so far removed from any other tools that we have, in a standard DW workflow. But they do have their own sound. I tend to generally prefer the sound of the recover mechanism for my mixes. It does seem to clean up the mids, open up the bottom end, open up the top end, give it a bit of like a modern sound, I guess, where Tame generally will control the low mids more, bring the mids forward a bit, and can be useful in some scenarios. In this particular mix, I'm not utilizing any of that. But why don't I drop this all the way down and pull it up so you can hear it in action. So at the extreme settings, it really pushes the crispiness up top, makes everything kind of into, pushes everything to a very modern mold, and can get overbearing, obviously, if you go extreme with those settings. But in this particular mix, I really am kind of digging right around 80, 85. We had 85 before, let's try that. As soon as it's bypassed, the mix becomes less balanced. I'm getting some harshness on that right-hand crash out of the drums. Basic guitars don't sit in the pocket as much. It seems more cloudy in general. So it's kind of insane that I could just dump this on the mix bus, tweak one setting, and get that much out of it. So I won't touch on these other controls a whole lot because I don't honestly use them very often. But if you're going to use Gullfoss on like a bus, like a bass bus or drum bus, you may get into these a bit. So bias would set the preference of the plugin to favor the recover mechanism or the tame mechanism. So if you have these where you like them, but you're just looking to slightly alter the balance there, that would be a tool to use. Brighten and boost both alter the end point the plugin is trying to get your sound to. So if you're working on, say, an electronic mix and it needs to have some crispy top end from some synth, and you feel like the plugin is fighting that, the brighten control will tell the plugin that you want a brighter sound overall and allow more of that through, or adjust its effect on the sound to be brighter overall once it passes through the plugin. Boost essentially does the same thing with the bottom end. So if you're using this on a bass guitar bus and it was trying to control that bass sound to more of a shape of what an overall mix might need to be, you could tell it, hey, no, I want more end to come through. So, crank that up to taste and let it know what you're looking for. Okay, let's switch it up a bit and take a look at how I was using Gullfoss earlier today on a mastering project. So now we're in a mastering project, and you can see I'm using a similar amount of the recover function, but I am using a bit of the tame function this time. These seem to be about, a ratio that I find myself gravitating towards, somewhere between 70 and 100 on recover and 20 and maybe 40 on the tame. But it really just depends on your particular project. So again, I'm not touching these at all. I find that it does, on a mix bus scenario, it does a pretty good job of just knowing where it needs to go. So I'll again bypass this and play a little bit without, and then turn it on a few measures into the song. So it's not doing a whole lot, other than this top end bit on the spectrum, but you can definitely hear the boost in the very top end. Whatever it is doing, these small changes here just really open up those mids, and this is the general effect that I really get with this. They seem to just clean up the mids, make room for stuff somehow, and just kind of give you like an extra 5 or 10% on your mix for almost free. Like, it takes no work. You just slap it on, tweak a few dials, move some numbers around, and your mix is better. It's kind of crazy. So while we're over here, why don't we mess with this tame function a bit so you can kind of hear what its primary effect on the sound is. And then we'll go into some general tips and tricks that I've kind of discovered, using Gullfoss over the past 6 weeks, 8 weeks. So it still sounds good, even at pretty extreme values, but it does tend to rob some of the meat of the sound, which you're always trying to balance out. So in most cases, in this particular case, I kind of like it right around this value here. So a few other ways I've found myself using Gullfoss is kind of like a helper earlier in the mixing stage. It's kind of like showing the mix to a buddy and having them give you some feedback, except you don't have to buy anyone lunch or return any text messages. You just slap it on either the mix bus, or if you're working on drum sound in particular, just throw it on your drum bus. Crank up the recover, maybe play with the tame, see what sounds good to you, see if it improves the sound at all, bypass that on and off for a bit, and then use that as a reference, to treat your drums. So if you're like, oh man, it's really clearing up some boominess in that kick drum, okay, well maybe bypass that, go to your kick drum processing and adjust it till you get a similar effect. And then you can go back and turn Gullfoss back on and be like, okay, cool, it's not doing as much of the kick drum now, but now I hear that it's cleaning up the upper mids and the cymbals. So kind of, you can sort of use the spectrum to get an idea of what it's doing, but often it's just moving too fast and it's difficult to really use that too much. So I'd recommend just using your ears, bypassing back and forth a few times, and then trying to replicate the elements of that sound that you like with static EQing or whatever your processes that you already have on your mix, whether that's multiband compression, static EQing, dynamic EQing, altering balances of different sources, whatever you need to do to kind of meet that reference that Gullfoss kind of showed you, kind of like work your way through the mist of the mix and then treat it appropriately. So one thing I think you're going to want to avoid is putting Gullfoss on your mix too early and leaving it there. As I just discussed, it's fine to throw it on a bus or your master bus, get some hints as to what you could treat, and then bypass it and then continue to work on your mix and the individual elements. I wouldn't suggest just tossing it on, cranking it up, and leaving it there in an early stage. It's going to be hiding problems in the mix that would be better treated at the individual elements rather than an EQ on the mix bus. Another thing is, once you have Gullfoss on your mix bus, if that's where you're using it, if you do need to go into the project and solo elements to work on them individually, go ahead and bypass Gullfoss, make the changes to your sound, unsolo that element, and then turn Gullfoss back on so you can hear how it sounds all together. I don't really have any complaints about Gullfoss. It's run pretty flawlessly for me. I have never had it cause a crash or any kind of instability issues. There are a few minor annoyances or features rather that I hope they might implement in future versions. The one thing that, especially when I was first getting used to the plugin, that I wished was available was a link function between these two that would almost act as like a mix knob, where I could grab a link icon in the middle here and pull them both down, keeping the ratio the same, or pull them both up, just to inflate or deflate the effect overall without changing that ratio. I feel like that would be handy, especially when you're getting the hang of the plugin. But really, once I've kind of discovered the sounds and how I generally like to use it, I don't feel like I'm missing that feature a whole lot, but it would be nice if they put it in. Another thing, and this is, I believe, is the only issue on the Windows version, is that there's no way to input values directly. So I typically, especially when I'm dialing something in to a detailed level, I would like to be able to click this and say 90 or 82 or something like that. And here I'm kind of stuck clicking it and holding, shift, I think, which is fine. You can still get to a pretty fine level of adjustment here, but I'd much rather just be able to click it, type in a value, move on. Another function it does have that I haven't used here is the ability to pull in these low pass and high pass filters. So if you find that it's doing something like it does generally like to add a pretty hefty amount of this very tippy top end, and that's not always appropriate. So if that's not what you're looking for, you can pull this down and either just kind of get to the edge just to control it a bit, or really remove that element completely, which comes in handy, especially if you're using it on maybe not a full mix, but in a bus scenario or something like that. So other than that, it's a beautiful plugin. It's large enough. I'm running at 1080 now, but I typically work at 4K, and some plugins are just so tiny that I'm like getting up to my screen to try and see them. This is nice and big, but not overbearing. Everything's legible, and it's kind of just nice to look at, which I actually value. I like to have GUI elements that are inspiring, and I don't have to fight through. It doesn't look like it was, came out of Windows NT from 1994 or something. So after about 2 months with Gullfoss, I am a pretty big fan. I think I've used it on just about every project that I've touched in that time. Usually it's just kind of doing a little bit extra on the mix bus at the end there. If that's all it's doing, then it's well worth the asking price, in my opinion, which at this point I believe is $99 for the Windows or the Mac version, or if you have two machines and you want to have both versions, I think it's $149. The Windows plugin did just come out recently. It's been available for Mac for I think over a year. So I've had my eye on it for a long time, but I do run a Windows machine, so I've just recently been able to really get into it. And I've been really happy with it so far. So that's about it for the video. If you're interested, I know they have a demo available. You can head to the website and check it out. I'll put a link to that below. Again, this is a brand new channel. It's a kind of new thing that I'm playing around with. So if you're into it, go ahead and subscribe and let me know if you have anything you'd like me to cover, whether that's gear, reviews, walkthroughs, technical tutorials, anything like that. I'm kind of looking for ideas, just sort of having fun, making some content for you guys to check out. So thanks for watching, and catch you guys later. Oh, hey, I'm not cool enough to have an outro B-roll sequence or anything like that. So here's a little bit of my dog Olive falling asleep to a lullaby. Okay, I think that's it. Hopefully it's not too fucking boring.